This video is on the principle known as code switching. Speakers of more than one language, like bilinguals or multilinguals, are known for their ability to mix their languages during communication. For example, in a bilingual crowd, you might hear speech like this. I was like, si me hacían en una pregunta de, how would I say this? I wouldn't be able to say it, si me están haciendo, consciously say it. In this example, the speaker has mixed together Spanish and English instead of saying the sentence fully in English like this. I was like, if they ask me a question on how I would say this, I wouldn't be able to say it if they are making me consciously say it. Code switching is the practice of intentionally mixing two or more languages in the same conversational interaction. It usually happens only when two or more people are talking and they both know that they share the same bilingualism. So, like you see in this picture, these different colors are representing different languages that these two people share in common. So each of them share two languages and they mix together in this conversational interaction. However, code switching is inhibited in the presence of monolinguals or in formal settings. This suggests that it's usually not an accident or an inability to speak one of the languages fluently enough to be able to do all the speaking in that conversation using one language. It also isn't a perversion of the languages. If these misunderstandings were the case, then the speakers who code switch would do it willy-nilly, even in situations where it might make them less clear or less understood. This kind of random switching without regard for the context really only happens in people who've experienced brain damage. But most of the time, people who are actually bilingual and engaging code switching are able to inhibit the times when it's not appropriate to do so and allow it to express itself in times when it is appropriate. Interestingly, code switching is hard when it's required of participants. So in one study, the researchers displayed numerals that were in different font colors. So, for instance, if the numeral appeared in orange, then they maybe had to they had to say the name of that number in Spanish. That would be siete. Sometimes the numbers would appear in blue, and in those cases, then they would have to say out loud the name of the number in English, like 4. And then they might, switch back to Spanish, and they would have to say uno, and maybe another Spanish one, they would say tres, and then they would see a blue one, and they would have to say 6, and then a blue one, and they would have to say 5, and then maybe it would switch to another language again, and they would have to say ocho. The principle here, and the major finding from this study, was that where the numbers switched color, and the participant therefore had to switch to the other language, the numeral naming process was slower. So right here, between the blue and the orange, it was harder for participants to switch from one language to the next and name this number uno, even though the participants were fluent in both languages. We would see the same thing here, where they were switching back from Spanish again to English, and from English again to Spanish. So in those transitional periods, it was harder to switch languages. And I've just illustrated a couple of numbers in a row, but in the real study, there would sometimes be strings of multiple numbers in a row in the same language, and then there would be an expectation of switching. But the other important finding from this study was that the slowdown was greater when people switched from their weaker to their stronger language. So let's imagine that the people in this study primarily spoke English, but they had learned Spanish as a second language, maybe in high school or something like that. Even if they were fluent, when they were switching from their weaker language to their stronger language, that would be when they were switching from Spanish to English. So in this transition right here, they were slower to switch back to their stronger language. Now, these two findings have a couple of interesting implications. This first one suggests that people are doing some work to inhibit the wrong language, so that when they have to switch away from the right language, the other one has been suppressed and is less accessible. This second principle here, or the second finding, here, suggests that this is actually like the opposite of what you'd think should happen. If English was their stronger language, when the participants saw a blue number after an orange number, they should have been faster to say these numbers, because this is their more fluent language. That should have been an easy transition back to their original language. But that's not what happened, since they were actually slower shifting back to their dominant language. This suggests that people were suppressing their dominant language with an extra force in order to make sure that that more fluent language didn't accidentally intrude into the Spanish task. And so it was more effortful because of that cognitive suppression. It was more effortful to switch back into their dominant language. So this study raises the question, if code switching on demand is hard to do, then why do people code switch at all? And the answer to this question is multifold. There's many, many reasons why people switch, but in order to understand these reasons, we have to first understand, most importantly, that in real life, people aren't being forced to code switch. They're doing it for strategic reasons when it's actually not harder, when it's easier to do. So one example would be that the other language has a better word or phrase that would reflect what they really want to communicate. Perhaps it doesn't have a good translation in the language of the dominant language of the conversation. And so they think back to a particular idiom or a word that doesn't have a good translation. And if they know their conversational partner is familiar with that word or phrase, there's no reason not to use it. So they just pull it out of the other language and then they stick it into the conversation. Another reason why people will code switch is because they want to add individual character or personality to what they're saying. And they recognize that it might just add a certain flair or a certain flavor to the conversational, the feeling of the conversation if they were to employ some phrase from another native language. There's a phrase in French that people often will pull into English. It's je ne sais quoi. It means just like a certain something that's unknown. And people will say this little phrase because both for the first reason that it doesn't have a very good translation, and also because it lends a certain character or feeling or a certain sophistication to English communication. A third reason is to signal a cultural identity. If you're speaking Spanglish, for instance, a mixture of Spanish and English, and you're speaking with other people who are also Latina or Latino, then by intermixing Spanish phrases or words into your communication, then you're signaling to each other that even though we're using English, the dominant language of this country that we're in, we're still digging into and retaining some of our cultural identity or cultural heritage. And we're still going to pepper that in to just kind of signal to each other that we're still part of this in-group. Another reason why people might code switch is because certain words or phrases are habitually ingrained. They're more easily accessible all the time. They're just it's harder to kind of make the habitual transition into using the dominant word in the language that you're communicating in. So a prime example of this is many people whose native language is Spanish and who later learn English. I have heard them in conversation use the word pero instead of the English word but as a conjunction in a sentence. So they'll be speaking along and the whole sentence will be in English, but they'll all of a sudden interject the word pero instead of the word but. And that's just because it's not intentional or cognitively strategic in any fashion. It's just a more accessible word because it's habitually ingrained from decades of communicating in a previous language. Certain filler words or certain conjunctions are just more easily accessed in their native language than in the updated language. Another reason why people might code switch is to explain something that might be too complicated in one language, the language of the conversation. So I remember I was doing a research study in Samoa once, and there are a lot of schools there that are held primarily in English, despite the fact that most people on the island don't speak English fluently or natively. We found in the study that the teachers would often switch, they would code switch from teaching in English to teaching in Samoan when students had questions that they weren't understanding the answers to in English, and they would ask for clarification. Then the teachers would code switch to make the explanation more easily understood and simpler, and then they would switch back to English to continue the regular instruction. They also might code switch if a word or phrase is momentarily more accessible in the other language. So this principle here differs from this principle here, because this in cases like pero versus but, you will see that these are habitually ingrained, but in some cases they're only momentarily more accessible. It's not a permanent kind of thing, but they become more easily accessed because of certain factors related to the sentence that's being spoken. So let's talk about a couple of examples of that. One prime example is when cognates are used, and cognates are words that have a common origin or etymology across languages. So one example here illustrated is the English word exactly, and you can see that it follows a very common spelling and sound across other languages like Swedish and Spanish and French and Italian and Portuguese and Filipino, where all of them have this same kind of exact something sound. So, you've got exact, exactamente, exactament, exactamente, exacto. And so you can see that they have this same basic form that they're following across different languages. If you've tried to learn a second language, you've probably come across cognates before between your first language and the language that you're trying to learn, where the words sound really similar, and it's easier to remember those words in the new language because they're so functionally and formologically and morphologically related to the word that you're familiar with already in your native language. So I want to look at the use of cognates in some particular research studies and then carry forward those findings into the practice of code switching. So in one study, researchers had participants stare at a cross in the middle of the screen, and then they would show 4 images in the corners of these grids, and they would tell the participants to look for the marker, or if they were giving the instructions and the task in an alternate language, Russian, then they would say look for the marke, because in Russian the word stamp is marka. And so when participants were given the instructions either in English or in Russian, there was a phonologically similar word in the other language. So marker and marka sound a lot alike, but not in the same language. In English, this is marker and stamp. And so you can see that there's only a conflict here, a phonological conflict, if you're accidentally accessing both languages at the same time. Now, you wouldn't think in a situation like this that if the instructions were given in English and you saw these pictures, that both languages would be activated. But we found in this study that actually these words interfered with each other, the phonologically similar words across languages. And the way we know that is because we compared a situation like this, where there was both a marker and a stamp or marka present, with other control conditions where there was only a marker and some other word that wasn't related phonologically, like a ruler, present in the array. And when you compare these two conditions, you would expect for the interference to occur here, but not to occur here. And that's exactly what we see. When the instructions were given in Russian, and they were told to find the marka, then people ended up in the interlingual condition where there was both the stamp and the marker present. They ended up looking at the distractor object a long time But in the control condition where there was just a ruler, they didn't spend hardly any time looking at the ruler. So this suggests that the distractor object, the marker, ended up interfering with their ability to process the actual thing that they were supposed to look at, the stamp or the marca. If the instructions were given in English, however, we found that there was not as much of a difference between the two kinds of conditions. We see here that the amount of time spent staring at, if they were told to look at the marker, the time spent looking at the stamp was not that different from the time spent looking at the ruler. A little bit more, but not as dramatic as if the instructions were given in Russian. And this just goes to show that the factors surrounding this interference will depend on which language is more fluent for you, which language is more prevalent in the culture in which, or the country in which you're performing these kinds of tasks. And so there's going to be like cues in the environment that are going to kind of cause your mind or your brain to be using one of these languages to a greater extent than the other, and will cause more or less interference with the alternate language. Now, this study suggests that languages aren't stored separately in the brain. They're kind of jumbled up and overlapping. Even if you think you're just using one, words from the other language can actually become activated. And that's shown in some fMRI studies where if you look at, for instance, here, this is Wernicke's area, you see in this study that the red and the yellow represent the native and second languages that these individuals speak, but the orange areas are those common areas or the overlapping areas in the brain where both languages use the same the same portions, the same cells in Wernicke's area, but some of the components of the language are stored in separate languages or in separate areas of the brain. The native language is, exclusively stored here, and the second language is exclusively stored in these yellow regions, but they do overlap. They do share some of that neural networking, and it's in those overlapping areas that we see the interference occurring in studies like what we just described. And we see these same kinds of findings in this same study in Broca's area as well, where you've got lots of overlapping between the native languages and the secondary languages. So what are the practical implications of this in terms of code switching? Well, cognates kind of encourage a code switching. So for instance, if a bilingual person uses a cognate early in the sentence, remember these cognates are the similar words across languages, then there's a higher likelihood they'll code switch toward the end of the sentence. So let's say that a person is using English and they're trying to say the sentence, "My father is the most difficult man." But they're also fluent in German, and subvocally, if you were to translate this sentence into German, it would say, "Mein Vater ist der schwerste Mann." Forgive me. So what might happen here is a code switching result that is an amalgamation of both English primarily and a little bit of German. And the reason why this would happen is because my and mine are cognates, and father and Vater are cognates, and is and der. Almost all of these first four words are cognates. And so that would, because you're intending to say these first four words of the sentence that are similar in English and in German, then there's a higher likelihood that your German language will interfere in this situation and just jump into the sentence. And you might say something like, "My father is the schwierigste man." In such a situation, you can see that code switching is accidental and only happened in that situation because that word is temporarily more easily accessed, but that temporary easily accessing happens because of the early cognates in the sentence priming the use of German toward the later end of the sentence.